And a word of advice for the Chancellor as he promotes this policy in coming days. Use your own car, and for heaven's sake, make sure you know how to use a debit card. And I look forward to the Prime Minister promoting the swimming pools policy. Unlike the car, he won't have to borrow one of those. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the cost of living crisis is not over. And once again, they've left money on the table when it comes to oil and gas companies. Yes. Money that could have been better spent on working people. Politics is about whose side you're on. There are loopholes that urgently need closing. Even the former CEO of Shell admitted that they should be paying more. Yes. And the long-term plan just isn't there. The same old Tory choices, the same three principles, sticking plaster politics, no growth for the many, working people pay. And you see those principles at play in our broken labour market. Much of what the Chancellor said today focused on that, as well it might. The figures announced in this budget show how damaging the current situation is to growth, a long-term drag on our ability to create more wealth. Our inactivity levels are particularly shocking, up 500,000 since the pandemic, the worst jobs recovery since the G7. People unable to work because of ill health more than ever before. Now, we will look at what the Chancellor's announced today, because on these benches we've long called for reform of the work capability assessment, for a welfare system that supports people with disabilities and long-term health conditions to thrive at work. The universal credit system must help people into employment, and childcare is a huge barrier to that. We've made the case for reform. But on childcare, of course, more money in the system is obviously a good thing. They obviously didn't listen to when he said he's actually going to do it.
They won't be here.
And we've seen the Tories expand so-called free hours before. And as parents up and down the country know, it's no use having more free hours if you can't access them. And it pushes the cost for parents outside the offer. That's what we've seen before. And on pensions, he made a big spending commitment, which will benefit those with the broadest shoulders, where many people are struggling to save into their pension. We needed a fix for doctors, but the announcement today is a huge giveaway to some of the very wealthiest. The only permanent tax cut in the budget is for the richest 1%. How can that possibly be a priority for this government? The truth is, our labour market is the cast iron example of an economy with weak foundations. Our crisis in participation simply hasn't happened elsewhere, not to this extent. It's a feature of Tory Britain, and global excuses won't wash. We need a wider reform agenda. Instead of making working people pay, we need to make work pay. Move on from growth that's based on insecure, low-paid jobs to growth which comes from good work, from strong employment rights that can deliver higher productivity, growth from the many, for the many, that makes people better off in all parts of our country. I welcome his announcement on devolution deals. The principle that we should push power out of Westminster is fully supported on this side of the House. In fact, we want him to go further. Communities beyond Birmingham and Manchester deserve the right powers and the same powers to drive growth as well. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor is a former Health Secretary, a published author on health, no less. He gave me a signed copy of his book. He knows that growth needs an NHS fit for the future. And no country can be fit for work when there are 7 million people on hospital waiting lists.
Nothing to say about that.
So I was waiting for him to match Labour's ambition, waiting for him to match our plan to train more doctors and nurses, to tackle the capacity crisis, a policy he publicly praised just 15 days before he became Chancellor. And yet it never came. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, if there was ever a symbol of the poverty of ambition, that is it. Because the reality is the country getting sicker is a country getting poorer. And a country getting poorer is a country getting sicker. Health and wealth must go together. Britain can't afford to be the sick man of Europe. Britain can't afford the Tories. And there is another way. On these benches, we understand institutions must be respected, constraints accepted, that fiscal rules should be sound and followed rigorously, that every pound is precious and must not be wasted. But they want to shout about their record. Let them shout. Wages lower, taxes higher, borrowing higher, debt higher. Their chaos has a cost. Certainty is vital for the growth we need, essential for businesses and investors in our country. As we've spelt out, compared with a blanket cut to corporation tax, investment allowances are the right approach. But the question many businesses will ask today is, how long before the wind blows again and we all go through this again? And that's what they don't understand about business investment. Their endless fighting on tax is bad for growth in and of itself. Madam Deputy Speaker, real stability means that taxes don't go up and down like yo-yos. That R&D tax credit regime doesn't get overhauled twice in 6 months.
Order. OK, that's enough. I now can't hear the right honourable gentleman at all. Exactly. And it's nothing to do with being old. None. Quiet. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you. Let me give an example of that instability. It's a bit of a fraught subject at the moment, but when he was Culture Secretary, the Chancellor apparently took some lessons on the rules of football. So let me provide a refresher. The amount of times his government has broken their fiscal rules, 11. That's one football team. The amount of times they've changed corporation tax policy, 22. That's 2 teams. You've got a game. But if he wants the post-max analysis, he'll have to consult the experts. Back on his screens and ours this weekend, I know the whole House will want to applaud that. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, a budget is not just about the choices made, but the choices ignored. Britain needs more than certainty for growth. That's the least we should expect. We need change, stability and success. Anyone listening to this and worried about NHS waiting lists, any about crime, it's about crime going unpunished. They don't want to hear about the waiting list. They don't want to hear about the crime going unpunished. House building rates falling. Don't want to hear about that either, I suppose, do you? They will have heard very little that makes them feel hopeful about our future. They could have used sensible taxation policies on non-DOMs or oil and gas companies and made the money work for working people, tackled the vested interests that gum up our planning system and shown real ambition on the investment we need to turn us into a green growth superpower. And that was the test today. Can we move beyond the usual sticking plaster solutions, set a new direction for growth that serves the interests of working people? But I'm afraid the verdict on this budget is clear. They won't offer change because they can't. And so our course is set. Managed decline, Britain going backwards, the sick man of Europe once again. That's the Britain they've created, and they should look it in the eye. Because today's figures on growth put their failures up in lights. After 13 years of Tory sticking plaster politics, 13 years of no growth for the many, 13 years of being asked to pay, working people are entitled to ask, am I any better off than I was before? And after 13 years, with no excuses left, nobody left to blame, no ambition or answers, the resounding answer is no, and they know it.
Right, now we'll just have things like just settle down a bit now, please. And if people are leaving, let's do so quickly and quietly, just out of consideration for everyone else who is still taking part in the debate. Before I come to... Come on, now get a move on. Before I come to the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and wonderful to have you back in the chamber today. After that torrent of socialist declinism from the opposition, I want to start by saying how lucky we are to have a lucky Chancellor. He has been lucky this winter because the weather has been a lot warmer than when he stood here in November, and as a result, the price of energy has come down. But he has also made some of his own luck, Madam Deputy Speaker, because thanks to the steps that he took, the financial markets have stabilised and he has had to pay less in interest than he was expecting to, about £4 billion. It is actually quite hard to believe that this is the first actual official budget that we've had in this chamber since October 2021. A lot of things have changed since the last time we had a budget. Our world-leading NHS vaccination rollout has ended the severe contagion of the pandemic, but Putin's evil and illegal invasion of Ukraine has sparked the worst inflation for 40 years. The challenges those events have placed on the public finances have been extraordinary, and the spending can't all be borrowed and passed on to the next generation. And that's why I welcome the news today from the Chancellor that he's forecasting 3% lower debt in years to come. Yeah. Our committee, the Treasury Committee, welcomes the fact that the budget is accompanied by forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility. We think that it's important that that stands alongside a budget. It's a key part of the independent framework for Chancellors, and we will be taking evidence from them next week on the underlying assumptions behind their forecasts. Because what has changed most perniciously since the last budget in October 2021 is inflation. It was only just beginning to rear its ugly head in October 2021. And as a member of the Treasury Committee throughout this entire period, I've been like Cassandra in highlighting some of the inflationary risks that we faced. Far from being transitory, as the Independent Bank of England hoped, inflation has become quite deeply embedded in the UK economy, in wage inflation and in expectations. And that's why I welcome the news today that the Office for Budget Responsibility is expecting that by the end of this year, inflation will be back down to 2.9% again. Because inflation is the worst tax that we have on our economy. It is a tax paid particularly by the very poorest, who spend the highest proportion of their incomes on food and energy. And so the Chancellor must not hear the siren voices urging him to increase or to abandon the inflation target that he gives to the Independent Bank of England. The top priority for our economy this year must be to at least halve inflation. It's to be welcomed that in his budget today, the Chancellor has tried to focus on measures that help to achieve that inflation target. The extension of the fuel duty freeze and the cap on household energy costs will all help to keep inflation lower by almost 1%, but lower than it would have been. And these may not feel like giveaways, but they do cost money against the do-nothing counterfactual option. So it's good to see that they're being implemented because of better public finances, and that these tax cuts can be seen as consistent with the government's second priority of reducing debt. In our recent Treasury Committee report, we called on the Chancellor to think again about the fiction that lies behind fuel duty forecasts. Every year they get embedded in the fiscal outlook, and every year Chancellors realise that it's not an ideal time to raise fuel duty. I welcome the fact that the fuel duty cut has been extended for another year, and that once again the fiction has not been followed through into reality. But I do think we need to think long and hard about why a tax that is inflationary, that harms growth, and is heading the way of the dodo as we all move to electric cars, is still in the forecast numbers. The third economic policy of growing the economy in a non-inflationary way will involve all of us working more productively. And the Stride Review, named after my illustrious predecessor, has rightly focused on this key question. And I think there were many measures that we can all see will be very helpful that were announced in today's budget, because with over 1 million job vacancies in our economy, we are still, as a country, working fewer hours than we were before the pandemic. And unlocking that human and economic potential is key to strong, productive, non-inflationary growth. So the steps that have been announced today on childcare and on pensions will help to ease the labour shortages that are pushing up wage demands, and they will help counter those inflationary pressures. And so the Treasury Committee looks forward to exploring all of these issues in detail with both our expert witnesses and with the Chancellor himself in our next evidence sessions, because the details really matter. The Treasury Committee has highlighted the new benefit cliff edges that my right honourable friend introduced last November when he announced that next winter only low-paid households will receive the £900 help with their cost of living. We asked for it to be spread into 6 instalments to reduce the risk of cliff edges. And we're sorry to hear that a somewhat clunky computer system means that there will be 3 instalments instead, because we worry that if you lose your job one day just after the qualifying date, you will miss out on a lot of help. And there are still cliff edges, taper rates and disincentives to work galore in our benefit and tax system, whether it's around free school meals, help with the childcare limits, child benefit tapers, tax-free childcare cliff edges, the withdrawal of a tax-free allowance, and the very welcome measures today announced on all those fronts, and with the pension cap abolition, will all be studied in detail by the committee. We're planning to work closely with our colleagues on the Work and Pensions Committee to find recommendations to smooth some of these cliff edges and distortions. And the Chancellor can see how these work as disincentives to adding more hours, and every hour of work should pay. I think that we've made huge progress towards that today. I think at any stage in life and at any age, you should be rewarded more the more you work. Speaking briefly as a constituency MP, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just want to welcome the help for swimming pools, for our pubs, for levelling up with Malvern theatres, and for our childcare providers and our nurseries. I think there's a lot of very good news for them today. The Chancellor's had some luck since November, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's shared that luck with UK households today. He has a clear intention to bring down inflation, to grow the economy and to reduce debt. May good luck continue to follow him, and may the extra billions of pounds of expense that he's scoring for the defence budget help our Ukrainian friends have good luck and to beat back the Russian invader. Slava Ukraini.
Spokesman for the Scottish National Party, Stuart Hosey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thought the chair of the Select Committee was about to launch a ship with that peroration at the end. If I may make a couple of small observations before I start. The Chancellor mentioned Nigel Lawson and his deregulation budgets in the past, and he spoke about the resolution of Silicon Valley Bank. I hope this government learned the right lessons from those episodes, and indeed from the 2008-9 crash. Do not weaken regulation. Do not weaken Tier 1 capital. Do not return the banking system into risk. Can I also say I was intrigued by many of the things he said about reducing economic inactivity. I'm sure some of the measures may well work. I think to add more and brutal sanctions to universal credit claimants was probably rather unconscionable, given everything else which is going on. He did seem to give the impression of broad, sunlit uplands, and there were lots of cheering and waving of order papers at the end. What the Chancellor actually described, though, it was a UK economy which has gone from the most robust in the G7 to one of the weakest. A UK economy where Brexit slammed the brake on UK investment. A UK whose performance deteriorated after the Brexit referendum, both in absolute and relative terms. A country which unilaterally imposed trade barriers with its nearest neighbours. And a country, the only one in the G7, where the economy has not returned to its pre-pandemic level. Now, one could make a case to say that was not all the fault of the government, but many of the difficulties were, and many were caused by the disastrous fiscal loosening by his predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Spelthorne. And we can see the problem the economy faces through the prism of debt interest. He's right in terms of what he said compared to last November, 4 months ago. But year on year, the debt interest payments are 30, 40, 50, £60 billion higher than they were a year ago. And for ordinary people, working people, the OBR confirmed in November, real household disposable income remains below the 2019-20 level and will do for the next 4 or 5 years. And I'm seeing nothing in the Red Book and the OBR forecast in the last few minutes that would change my mind about that assessment in November. So I think we had every right today to expect this budget would begin to address more of the long-term issues the economy faces and action to tackle some of the cost burdens on ordinary people. And these long-term issues were addressed by both the CBI and the TUC in their submissions to this budget. On growth, the CBI said the UK economy continues to face global and domestic headwinds with the prospect of several more years of low growth. The TUC said the government is arguing once more that the state of the public finances is a reason to restrict economic growth, flying in the face of evidence to the contrary. On productivity, the CBI noted Britain has experienced 15 years of low growth and flatlining productivity. The TUC called to get productivity rising by rebooting the skills system. On exports and trade, both said broadly the same things, the CBI saying the government should work with businesses across the UK's nations and regions to kick-start an exporting boom. On the supply of labour, the CBI said acute labour and skills shortages are an albatross hampering UK growth. And the TUC said there's a recruitment and retention crisis in public services. And on green energy, on the green economy, the CBI said going green is essential both for our international competitiveness and our energy resilience, and the TUC demanded that the government institute the Green Jobs Task Force with a long-term remit and regulatory capacity to plan to decarbonise the economy. I'll come to many of these things, and there will be some measures in the budget, there always are, to be welcomed. The changes he announced on prepayment meters, it will help. More support for local charities, it will help. The replacement for the corporation tax super deduction, absolutely essential. That could not be allowed to simply fall off the table. The problem is that when one even has a cursory glance at the Red Book and the OBR forecast, there's little to indicate they've really understood or are taking seriously tackling the issues raised. On growth, the OBR forecast makes clear the impact of government investment. It's negative in 2025, 26 and 27, a drag on growth for most of the forecast period. On productivity, even on the government's favoured productivity per hour metric, it does not reach 1.5 in any year in the forecast period, below the 2% historic rate. And the much vaunted £20 billion of R&D spend by 24-25, announced 3 or 4 times before today. Not mentioned today, but I'm assuming it's still on the table, as is the £1 million a year permanent annual investment allowance. I welcome those things. The problem is with inflation the way we've had it and inflation forecast. Those figures, that allowance, will not buy the £1 million a year or the £20 billion of R&D spend that it was originally anticipated to do. On exports, trade and the balance of payments, the current account balance remains negative for the entire forecast period, and being outside the EU single market remains a drag on the ability of firms to trade easily with our nearest neighbours. On the supply of labour, and the Chancellor, to be fair, did speak a lot about this, employment is forecast to rise, but that will barely dent the labour and skills shortages throughout the economy. My view, and my party's view, is only reversing Brexit and ensuring free movement of people will do that. But even within the framework which we have, it's instructive, isn't it, that with 16+ unemployment rate at 3.1%, unemployment rate at 3.1%, an employment rate of 76.5%, and an economic inactivity rate down to 21%, Scotland has the best employment, best unemployment and best economic inactivity rate of any of the nations of the UK. It demonstrates rather clearly that a competent and compassionate SNP government can deliver on employment where the UK government is failing. And on going green, again, the Chancellor made great merit of this. There were some interesting things said. The £1 billion a year investment or so in carbon capture and storage, to be welcomed, but we will look very carefully to see where it's spent. There was no mention, for example, of the Acorn project in Peterhead, a project, of course, that had £1 billion of funding pooled almost a decade ago. But he did mention small modular reactors, nuclear power, which, of course, is at the heart of the government's energy policy. I think it's useful, given this is now back on the agenda, that we look at the economics of this. The primary, and on SMR, before I moved on, remember, this is pipe dream stuff. There's not a single small modular reactor design which has even been licensed for use. But the primary mechanism to drive investment in nuclear is either the regulated asset-based model or a guaranteed price for electricity with a strike price, almost double that of real renewable energy, linked to CPI for 35 years. There are loan guarantees to transfer project risk, including that of cost overruns, to the government and then the taxpayer. There's a waste disposal service for spent fuel and other waste, and the price of those contracts is set according to the government's methodology, but if the price go above a cap, they too will be passed to the government and the taxpayer. And then, of course, there's a commitment by government to manage decommissioning cost overruns, even though it is impossible to know what they'll be, because they do not become apparent until the decommissioning takes place. Massive costs to the consumer and a near unlimited contingent risk placed on the taxpayer. But here's the rub when they call it green or renewable. Allowing 1 or 2 generations to buy expensive, overpriced nuclear energy, nuclear electricity, and then forcing the next 50 generations to decommission, store and guard toxic nuclear waste is not green. Now, you will recall, I'm sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Government introduced their new fiscal charter last year. Net debt to fall as a share of GDP in the 5th year of a rolling programme, and public sector net borrowing not to exceed 3% of GDP in the same year. Now, when the OBR reported in the autumn, those targets were due to be met in 27-28. 0.3%, 0.6%, 9.5 billion and 18.6 billion, if my memory serves. Now, they're forecast today still to be met. Interesting, though, the net debt measure is now showing a margin of only 0.2%. What this does tell us, though, because the debt figure is different, is that there's probably a little more headroom than anticipated only 4 months ago. So the expectation should have been that the Treasury did more to tackle domestic and business energy costs, particularly for SMEs, that it continued to act to squeeze inflation down where it had the power to do so, and that it ensures things within its control, public sector pay, the minimum wage, the state pension, social security rises, as they did in November, do not leave people any worse off. Because if they do not do that into the future, then energy price hikes, inflation, weak pay rises will continue to erode people's standard of living. And we certainly know from the November OBR forecast, inflation was set to peak at a 40-year high, and that wages and living standards were still set to be squeezed by around 7%, wiping out all of the growth from the past 8 years. What do we know today that we didn't know then? Telecoms prices due to rise. BT are putting their costs up 15% at the end of this month. Grocery prices continue to rise if you can get fresh produce at all. Grocery inflation rose in February to a record high of 17.1%. That will add the best part of £1,000 to the average family shopping basket throughout a year, and we know that families are really beginning to feel the pain of increased mortgage costs. So it's obvious the government today had 3 urgent tasks, all of which ought to have been designed to deal with things which matter to the public. Firstly, to continue to support businesses struggling with high energy costs, not simply to freeze the cap, although it is not a cap at all, but to reduce it. To recognise this cap as an average and pay attention to the fact that a UK average energy bill of £2,500 in Scotland will mean £3,000 or £3,500. They should have supported the reduction to £2,000 and maintained the £400 energy bill support scheme. Secondly, the government ought to have continued to bear down on inflation, and forcing down energy prices would have helped with that, as it did last year. 3.5% last year was the impact, another 2% at the current rates this year. And they could have gone further by mandating the regulators to stop the blatant price gouging and profiteering by energy and telecoms companies. And thirdly, as I've said, they needed to ensure today, or even signal their intention, when it comes to the things under their control, the next round of public sector pay, benefits, minimum wage, pension settlements, that nobody falls behind. And they could have gone further to introduce real fairness and raise more cash to really support the economy and really boost trade. Ending non-dom status, not mentioned today. Taxing share buybacks, not mentioned today. Not doing, but scrapping costly vanity nuclear power projects and investing in real green renewables. And fundamentally, Madam Deputy Speaker, rejoining the EU single market to give our exporters and our economy a fighting chance to recover.
Before I call the next honourable member, it will be obvious.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.